Welcome. This is Debra and Clement, and thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Shortcut to the Soul. Before I get into today's topic, I want to make an announcement. Should have made it in the last episode, but forgot. So going forward, new episodes are going to be released on Saturdays. In the past, it's been on a Thursday, but going forward, we're going to be on Saturdays. Also, while I am doing my best to release an episode every week, there are going to be some periods when, we're going to skip a week. And I won't be announcing it beforehand because, quite frankly, I won't know. It sort of depends on how the flow goes. I'm busy. I always get busier, of course, as the end of the year comes with clients, but I'm also busier because I'm putting together courses, I'm putting together some books, so a lot of projects right at a lot of times, but really trying to get a couple of them done. And so that's really where my time is going. And I've got a couple little deadlines that I'm working towards. So we'll see how it goes, but we're going to try to get the shows out, in a timely manner. And all right, now that is out of the way, let's talk about today's topic, which is finding love in the horoscope. So, love in the horoscope, whether it's for you want to look at your friends' charts, your kids' charts, clients' charts. Love is a big topic, right? It's important. It's important to a lot of people. And I guess it should be important to everyone, but let's face it, it's more important to some people than to others. And when it comes to love and the potential for love or the promise of love in the horoscope, because it is not the same for everyone. And that's just the way it is. I look at charts. Saw one the other day reading a client, and that potential for love, that potential for, this deep union from here through eternity, it's there. It's there, and it's such a wonderful thing to see. And then there are many other charts where, it's a really rocky road. And as far as finding that and having that, it's kind of questionable. Is the potential there? Yes. But it's not, we all come here for different reasons. And when you come here and one of your main lessons is learning about relationships, and like I always say, some people it's family relationships, but if it's romantic relationships, there are so many chances to get it wrong. I know because I have one of those charts. That's why. So, if I look at my own chart and the promise for a romantic relationship, there's potential for it, and that's the word I'm going to use, potential. Promise, But I get it, and so I get it, but I also get how important it is, in life, and certainly when I was much younger, it was a much bigger deal to me than it is today. But let's talk about the chart and the houses that you look at, all right? So whether you are looking for the potential or the promise of love or money or health, especially health, you also include the ascendant, and I want to mention that today because for those of you who heard the podcast about finding money in the chart, I don't think I talked about the ascendant. So let me just say that you always look at the ascendant, you look at the chart ruler, the planet that rules the ascendant, because hey, that represents the person. And so it's the approach to life, right? It's the person, it's also their approach to life. And so if the approach to life, after you interpret the aspects, is somebody who is, an initiator, a go-getter, that's going to tell you something. If it's somebody who is, who self-sabotages, well, that's, you want to take that into consideration as well. But putting the ascendant aside, what are the houses that you look at for the promise of love, the potential of love in the chart? Okay, 5, 7, and 8. Those are the 3 houses. So let's start with the 5th house. And I've got to say, I love the 5th house. I was going to say who doesn't, because it is the house of fun. And if you think about the 5th house and the things that it rules, besides obviously romance and love affairs, but it's also, children, pregnancy is connected to that as well as it is to the 8th house. But it's the house of anything that gives you pleasure. And of course that includes, hobbies and things like that, and any type of pleasurable pursuit. So pretty much everything from the 5th house is good. So the 5th house to me is a house of expansion in that respect, very much like the 9th house. So love those 2 houses, 5 and 9. But we're talking about 5. So 5th house of romance. the sign that is going to be on the cusp, well, it's certainly going to discuss or describe the approach to romance, right? And the planets in the fifth house, of course, that's going to add to it as well. But when you think about the fifth house, and this is why it's so important, when you're looking at relationships, or I should say, we'll say the promise for love, but we're talking about relationships here. The fifth house is where it starts, okay? And honestly, I know this sounds, I'm going to say the fifth house when it comes to love, it's not that it's as good as it gets, okay? But it's where it starts, where it tends to be, that's where the excitement is. That's the fifth house is, you're out, you meet somebody. I guess today maybe you contact them through an app, whatever the case may be. But it's that first connection, that interest, that excitement. You want to call it the butterflies, whatever, and it's the fifth house is the, oh my God, they've, in my day it was like, oh, the phone rang and it was them. Today I guess it's right. Very often I know it's a text, but it's gotten so much more impersonal. But it's that type. That's the energy. It's the excitement. And it's also, and this is what I'm sort of saying about as good as it gets, not that that's really true, but the fifth house is the beginning of romance. It's when we're really into the person. We're all on our best behavior. Whatever we want. Yes is the answer to everything. Can I do you a favor? Yes. Can I give you a ride? Yes. Whatever it is, the question. But it's that exciting time when we want to impress each other. Everything is new, right? It's new. It's exciting. And there's all this, I'd say, all this hope. Now, on the other side, fifth house can also just be a one-night stand. It can be friends with benefits. Fifth house, because it is love affairs. But the fifth house, to me, I always call it Mr. or Ms. right now. And the potential may be, and the hope may be, that this person that has come through the fifth house is going to be our partner, in long term. But fifth house, kind of like the gatekeeper. Everybody comes in through the fifth house. All your potential romantic partners come in through the fifth house. But do they get past the fifth house? That's the question. And so when we think about relationships, and again, you meet somebody, it's exciting, and it's those first few dates or whatever, however it may go. But there's those, those benchmarks. It's kind of like, and again, maybe, I don't know how things are today, but speaking from my, experience, when you met somebody, and if you were going out and it was 3 months and you were still together, it was like, okay, right? You get together 6 months, there's a lot more security. It seemed like, okay, this is really a relationship. But very often those first, 3 months, high attrition rate, go out, not so interested, doesn't turn out to be, what I think it is, right? So fifth house, think of that as, I'm going to call it the gateway. Everyone comes in through that, and it's exciting. So the fifth house cusp, that sign is going to give you an idea of what the approach is. Do you rush in? Are you passionate? Are you cautious? It's also going to talk about, or I should say describe, well, what appeals to you when it comes to romance, all right? And again, the planets on the chart, of course, in the fifth house are going to make a difference. The planet that rules the sign is going to make a difference. But generally the fifth house, it's how you approach romance. It's also, there's something, hold on here. It'll come back to me. It'll come back to me. It's the approach, and it is what you attract, but what you respond to. That's what I wanted to say. Because let's face it, some people respond more to romantic gestures, right? To the little, to the ambiance, let's say, right? And just maybe to really refined manners, opening the car door. And other people don't really care. So that's very much connected, I'm going to say to you, to the fifth house. The trappings of romance. That's what I'll call it. It's the trappings of romance. What do you enjoy? And even in terms of what do you give? Besides what do you enjoy in the trappings of romance, it's not just what people do for you, but it's what you enjoy doing for them. You might be the type that, for your romance, it's coming over and I'm going to cook you, a home-cooked meal. And for somebody else, it might be going out, for a dinner somewhere, or going to a stadium, to a sports event. That's all going to be described by the fifth house. And when I say the fifth house in its entirety, the sign on the cusp, the planetary ruler of that house. So if Aquarius is on the fifth house, you're going to look at Uranus in the chart. Okay. Now, some of you, let me just say this. Some of you, if it happens to be Aquarius, you may also look at Saturn, right? Because Saturn used to rule Aquarius. Same thing, Pisces, you might also look at Jupiter. Scorpio, you might also look at Mars. Generally speaking, I do not work. Okay, they're sub-rulers. I don't really work with them a lot. If I'm at hate to say at a loss, but if there's not much going on, so here's the example I'm going to use. If Aquarius is on the fifth house and you look at Uranus and it's not, let's say it's unaspected, which is significant, would be significant in its own. But if not much is going on and you felt the inclination, well, I want to see if there's more, by all means then, look at Saturn and see what's going on. But as I say, that is, it's up to you. If you routinely work, with the sub-rulers, great. I don't mention them just because, honestly, for the most part, I do not work with them. But you're going to look at the sign on the cusp, the planetary ruler. What house is it in? Because the house that the ruler of the fifth house falls in is certainly going to bring in some more information. Now, it may not bring in a lot of information connected to romance, because fifth house, remember, it's hobbies, it's interests, it's things that you're passionate about. And so I'm just going to say to you, it could be if the ruler of the fifth house is in the ninth house, well, you may just be passionate about traveling, right? Or passionate about learning. But you can look at it from the point of view, if we're talking about romance, that what is an interest in a romantic partner? Think about that. Well, the person may need somebody who also, has a sense of adventure, wants to travel, something, of that nature. So it does relate, but you may not, every single thing connected to the house where the ruler falls may not, exactly, connect to romance. So sort of a little bit of discretion there. And then, of course, we're looking at the aspects, all of the aspects to the ruler of the fifth house, because is there flow? Do we have some trines? Do we have some sextiles? That's going to show us a little bit more of ease and flow. If we have squares, conjunctions can show intensity. If we have squares, if we have oppositions, for example, well, that can indicate some bumps along the way. Quincunxes, a quincunx to the ruler, adjustments. One quincunx isn't bad if there's a few of them. That can suggest that there's it's not the most comfortable. It's not the most comfortable road. So planets in the fifth house, and if you don't have any, hey, that's fine. Sometimes an empty house is better, honestly, than having, let's say, a Mars-Saturn conjunction in it. And speaking of that, I actually will mention Saturn. Saturn in the fifth house. To me, Saturn in the fifth house is one of the toughest Saturn placements. It's not the worst Saturn placement in my mind, but it is a tough one when it comes to relationships. And usually the happiness, the gratification, doesn't mean it's denied, but it is very often delayed, and the person sort of has to wait for it. Saturn in the fifth house, because it is associated certainly with, I say, burdens. And so relationships, either they come later or there is, I hate to say it's not as easy to have fun, but there's usually the individual has a lot of responsibilities in their life that may interfere with romance or having fun. It's not necessarily that the romantic partners that they choose all, add some, I would say some burdens to them. It's possible, but generally speaking, it's not the case. It is a little bit more that has to do with a delay where the person may experience more loneliness or just feel that, everyone else, finds somebody else so much easier. So the other side, though, I do want to say, Saturn in the fifth house, commitment. Person is committed. They're taking relationships seriously. Not the type of person, talking fifth house, and like I say, it can be one night stands. Saturn in the fifth is usually more of a serial dater. There might be years of, years in between when it's just, there's nobody. It could be a little bit of, it can be by choice as well, quite frankly. But so Saturn in the fifth, just want to mention that. But the planets, of course, if there are planets in the fifth house, you look at the nature of the planet, the sign that it's in. And yes, you are going to look at the house, that planet rules in the horoscope. And you'll always do that. You just always do that. That's why we talk about the synthesis, right? Blending everything together. It's a lot of moving parts, right? When it comes to astrology. And so you look at the planets, and if you have a stellium, you have 3 or more planets, let's say they're in a conjunction in the fifth house, well, certainly there's a big emphasis in that person's life connected to the fifth house. And it could be romance. They can have a very colorful, very full romantic life, for better or for worse, depending on the planets. It can also, though, be connected to children. They can be very athletic. All right, a lot of athletes have a strong fifth house. So it's not always just all about the romance. And so fifth house, as I say, it's where it starts. It's where we get excited. It's where we have all this hope, for love. And as far as that promise goes, and I want to just mention this, you can have a fifth house that is wonderful. It's beautifully aspected. It's plentiful. Plenty of romantic opportunities. You have great romances, great courtships. That's the fifth house. Doesn't mean that relationship is just great and your marriage is going to be wonderful. Same thing. You can have a tough fifth house. Romance takes a long time. Finally, until you meet that person, it may be a little bit of a rough course, but you can have that happy marriage reunion of from here through eternity. Because in that respect, the houses, they do operate, I hate to say separately, but that's the way I'm just going to put it. So it starts in the fifth house, and let's say it's great. It's wonderful. You meet all these people. And then one goes a little bit longer. And so the question comes, your fifth house romances, do they get to the seventh house? Because that's the second house, right, that we look at. Seventh house, that's your house of marriage and committed relationships. Now, back in the day, as I'm going to call it, back in the day, fifth house relationships, if a couple was living together, when I was learning astrology, you didn't look at the seventh house. You looked at the fifth house because in that day we used to say it was illicit. Okay? Well, times have changed. I stopped doing that a long time ago, actually, because with seventh house, the whole thing with marriage, for how many years? If you were gay, you couldn't get married. And yet, people in relationships, they were married, let's be honest. They just didn't have that piece of paper. And even, with anybody else, there are couples who are legally married, but there's really no commitment there. And then you have couples who are not married, and the commitment is. So sometimes it gets a little fuzzy there. But for astrology's purpose, when we are talking about that committed relationship, the long haul, we are looking at the seventh house. So, you look at your fifth house of romance, and then you look at that seventh house. And where do you start? All right. Of course, you start with the sign that's on the cusp of the seventh house. And the thing I want to say about the seventh house, we have to keep in mind, it's all it's our one-to-one relationships. When we say committed relationships, and I mean that, but the right relationships, you have a vested interest in them. And that's why it also includes your best friends. And it's the house of marriage. It is the house of divorce. It's a legal house, but it's the legal house where people sue you. So that's why the seventh house kind of cuts both ways. And so that's why it makes it so important for relationships, because I hate to say which way does your seventh house go, but is it a more adversarial seventh house, right? Or is it got a lot more harmony? So certain things, Venus in the seventh house is certainly a Venus-Jupiter conjunction. From dreaming, might as well pick something good, right? So let's say a Venus-Jupiter conjunction in Libra in the seventh house. Lovely. A Mars-Saturn conjunction in the seventh house is not as lovely, and especially it's a little bit more I'm going to say, adversarial. Pluto in the 7th house, as well. Not the easiest placement, just to think of a few here. But you're going to start with that cusp. What is the sign on the cusp? Because that is going to tell you right off the bat your approach to committed relationships. And the thing about, when we talk about the approach to romance and fun, yeah, some of us may be more serious, some of us may be more lighthearted, but we're not in that committed. We're not in the long haul. And I don't want to say it doesn't matter as much, but sort of doesn't matter as much in some ways. But when you get to the 7th house and you're talking about making a journey through life with someone, what do you need? And that's the key of the 7th house, because like I say about the 5th, when it's that romance, it's what we respond to. It's kind of like what we want. And think about this. The 5th house is in the natural zodiac is Leo. It's ruled by the sun. The sun is our wants. It's the ego also, but it's what we want. And what we want is not always what we need. And sometimes it is, and then it works out nicely, but not always. But that 7th house, that tells us, yes, in a partner, yes, what we attract, but it's also what we need in a relationship. So when you're looking at that 7th house and you're looking at that sign on it, and just as an example, if you've got Aquarius or Sagittarius on the 7th house, or I could say Gemini, throw that one in as well. Well, to be honest with you, that person, what do you need? You need a partner, number one, who's going to give you some freedom. All right. And doesn't mean you're going to, be running around or anything on them, but it does mean or that you can't make a commitment, but you need somebody who has a little bit of independence. All right. Who's not going to smother you. And yes, there are other things in the chart that can, counterindicate it, but to some degree, for here, to make it simple, you're going to need somebody who's got, gives you some freedom, gives you some space, someone with a little bit more of a sense of adventure. On the other hand, let's say you've got, Pisces on the 7th house, all right? Or Cancer, or even Libra. Well, you may want to spend more time with your partner, somebody who's with you a lot more physically. I'm not saying, you're always holding hands even when you're shopping in the supermarket, but you may be. I've seen that. So, that 7th house, the attitude towards committed relationships, the approach to it, and what you need. And in terms of the approach, again, do you rush in? Let's say Aries is on the 7th. Are you very cautious? Does it take you a long time to commit? Let's say Taurus, for example, on the 7th house. Do you live for relationships? Yep, you know what I'm coming here, right? Libra, right? Libra on the 7th house, for example. So the approach to the relationship, of course, is going to be shown by the sign on the 7th house. And then you're going to say what planet rules the sign, where is it in the chart, what are the aspects. Now, when you're looking at the 7th house ruler, and you are, looking for it in the chart, that will tell you about your partner. Okay, that can tell you about the partner. It can also tell you about your close friends. And just for example, I'm just going to give you an example. If the ruler of the 7th house, for example, is in, let's say the 2nd house. I want to say that it's in the 2nd house. Well, the ruler of the 7th and the 2nd, one of the things it tells me that what you need, whether you realize it or not, when it comes to relationships, is you may recognize that money is important to you. Not that you're looking for a free ride, but that you want the person, let's say, to be able to support themselves or, maybe support you. But the other thing is the 2nd house is a house of values. And this is why I say it's not always conscious, that what you really may need is somebody who agrees with you on whatever it is, what your priorities are. And these are some things that, especially as we get older, we realize, of course, everybody, wants this, everybody needs this. But a lot of times we don't. We're so just wrapped up in seeing, especially in the beginning, right? All the, the good. Because we've just sort of come out of that 5th house. We still have that glow about us. And here we are getting into the 7th house, which is a relationship that over time, it is where we get comfortable. We're there in the long haul. The excitement, at time, I'm just going to say to you, sort of tends to fade, not in the sense that we're not interested anymore, but in the sense that we become used to it, become familiar, we become secure in the relationship. Now, there are some aspects, of course, that will say we may have insecurity in relationships, and that might be a lesson that we are here to learn. If Uranus is aspecting the rule of the 7th house, maybe making a square to it, well, it could be a few things. Relationships could start suddenly, end suddenly. Maybe that we're attracted to people who are very different. All our friends shake our heads and say, God, what does she see in this person? But the other side of it is that when Uranus is connected, there can be an instability. But the other thing I want to say is the rule of the 7th house. You look at the aspects, besides where it falls in the house, but to the planets. And if the 7th house ruler, let's say it's trining Mercury. I'm going to say that. Well, it's going to tell me two things about the partner. Is going to be somebody who can communicate, who can likely excel in conversation. But it really tells me about the person. What do they need in a relationship? They need someone who excels in conversation. They need someone who is interesting. I don't care how good they look in the morning. If the person they meet turns out to be dull, boring, they perceive them as stupid, they're not going to stay for breakfast. So just to give you an idea, along that line of the 7th house. But the key to the 7th house, it is like, as I'm going to call it, the long haul. And so 7th house, we look at it as the most important. And a lot of us, we tend to go to that 7th house first because we're looking sort of the end result. But it starts with that 5th house, because the thing is this, even though, as I said to you, the 5th and the 7th can kind of stand on their own, great 5th house, difficult 7th house, vice versa, they are still related. And so if you respond to, it's really important to you to have, romance, okay? Let's say really romantic evenings. Well, you still need that, even if it's not reflected strongly in the 7th house, it is still part of your, we'll call it your astrological, DNA. If there's no connection to it in the 7th house and it's not reflected at all in the 7th house, then that may be something that it's not something that comes when you're in the marriage, in the romance. You may have it, then you get married, and it's like, oh man, they've become so complacent. They don't, they don't open the car door anymore, or whatever it is. They don't take out. Listen, it might be, hey, they stop taking out the garbage, because we all have our priorities, right, on what we want our partners to do. And so you have house 5, you have house 7, and then there's house 8. Okay? And house 8 is a house of intimacy. And we do think of it, of course, right, when we think of intimacy, and it is a house of sex, as is the 5th house. But there's a difference so here's the difference in sex, right? 5th house it's just the hormones are raging. We're so excited and can't wait to jump on top of you. The 8th house, it's ruled by Pluto. And that's about merging. So it is the merging on the physical, right? Which can lead to procreation. But it's also merging on the spiritual, right? The emotional, and also the financial. Because the 8th house, that's your shared financial assets. Assets, it is, yeah, assets. And so that is why when we're talking about, we're saying finding love in the chart, but really what I'm talking about is not just love, it's finding that union, that lasting union. The 8th house is extremely important. It's also trust, because when we talk about intimacy, and again, yes, the physical, but it's about trust. And so you want an 8th house that is is strong, is in good shape, ideally. And so what is your approach to intimacy? All right. And what is your approach to trust? Because here, intimacy, we're not talking about the 5th house, those, friends with benefits and one night stands, where we're not really connected to it. It's just, hey, it's fun. For some people, it might just be exercise. But for the 8th house, we are talking about something that is much deeper and much more meaningful. So when you look at that sign on the 8th house, it is going to tell you your approach to intimacy, your approach to trust, the planets in there as well. And while they are separate, okay, the money part, but connected to the union is the money. So it's also your approach or your attitude towards shared assets. And that goes to the trust. When you look at the chart, are you someone, let's say some people from day one, no, we throw everything in together. I don't need a prenup. I don't want a prenup. I'm not going to give you a prenup. And then there are other people who are very much, hey, you know what? Let's keep our assets separate. And not that anyone is right or wrong. It really just comes down to, though, what is your attitude? What is your approach to it? And even when we get to the intimacy, even though I talk about the 8th house and I say, oh, it's deeper and it's more meaningful, and it is, but it doesn't mean that everyone's approach to it is the same and is this, is the same depth. Let me put it that way. You can have an attitude, and here's the example I'm going to use, is if, Cancer, let's say Cancer is on the 8th house, for example, and so the emotions, really being in love, feeling emotionally connected is very important for intimacy. And there may be more cuddling, okay? The sex act itself may be great, but it may be more about the closeness. I'm going to say the closeness, the cuddling, the conversation, the pillow talk. Put Sagittarius on the 8th house, okay? And it's just as meaningful, but it may be a little bit more like, great, we do it, it's, wow, it's wonderful, it's fun, okay, rockets go off, all that kind of stuff. And then when it's over, the cuddling may not be a big deal. It may be like, okay, well, what should we do now? Should we go out for dinner? So that's why I say it has to do with, with the attitude. The ruler of that 8th house, of course, you're going to say, hey, what house does it fall in? And you are going to look at the aspects. In terms of looking at the house that it falls in, and I want to say, again, depending on the house, how much relevant information will be connected to intimacy to some degree. It will absolutely depend on the house, but you will probably find more insight connected to the attitude of trust and shared, and I'm just going to say to you, and shared resources. So, and here's an example I'm just going to say to you. When the ruler of the 8th house is in the 4th house, it's very often, I hate to say a foregone conclusion, because again, other things can, counter it in the chart. But usually, the couple, the attitude is that we are going to own a home together. It's important to have part of our shared assets is invested in property, or it might be just be real estate besides a home. So it's going to very much depend on those factors. But an 8th house also bringing it's the house of inheritance. So I want to mention that because here you're in a union. Let's say you're married, and the ruler of the 8th is in the 10th house or the 4th house, just because it's a parental axis. And it may speak to, at a time in the future, an inheritance coming from a parent, your parent, their parent, but a parent. Okay. And I know if we're looking at your chart, the 4th and the 10th, right, we would say, well, maybe it's your mom and your dad. But if we look at, derived houses, which is we read somebody else through the chart, it still comes out to a parental house for your partner as well. And that may be something that an inheritance comes, or a gift. Doesn't have to be inheritance. A parent is very generous. Here's a gift. Hey, here's a house. And, you've got it. And it's something that is going to be shared. So that's why when I say finding love in the chart, it's 5, 7, and 8 plus the ascendant are the houses that you want to analyze. And I know this is, seriously, listen, it's just skimming the surface of it. It's really just the basic rules. But these are the houses that you want to examine. And the thing I want to say to you to keep in mind is, if the 5th house isn't so great, look at that 7th house, because if that promise is still connected to the 7th house, it might take a little while to get there, but it's there. On the other hand, if your courtships are wonderful, and I'm going to just say this, in my own chart, I've got a great 5th house. I really do. My 5th house is wonderful. And I've never had a problem attracting people. Never had a problem, honestly, getting marriage proposals. It's been great. The romance part of it has been great. It goes to that 7th house, to the point of the commitment. I do have some good energy there. But once we get into the 7th house, and I say there is some good connections to my 7th house, but once you really get into it, and that Mars-Saturn conjunction comes, into play, and that's why I do own this, and of course, when we're looking at love in the chart, and I'm looking at the houses, I'm also going to say, what else are you going to look at? Well, you are going to look at Venus, right? You're going to look at Venus because Venus rules your committed relationships. And I can say you could look at the sun because you know it rules the 5th house, but I'm going to say if you're looking for love, look at Venus, number 1, because it is that love. Of course, it also rules money, and a lot of relationships, marriages go down. Why? Because of money, right? Because of finances. So you look at Venus. Is it retrograde? Is it unaspected, right? Just for, an example, is it, were you born when it was on a station, when it's stationed? What house is it in? What are the aspects to it, right? All very, very important, the houses that it rules. But you look at Venus, and you can have a tough 5th or 7th house. And if Venus, you've got a beautiful trine to Pluto, especially Venus applying to trine to Pluto. To me, there's a happy ending. There's a happy ending there, in sight. And of course, you could look at the asteroid Juno as well. So Juno is known as the marriage asteroid, and maybe we'll do a show on that another time. But Juno is about marriage. Now, Venus is also, connect Venus to marriage, 7th house. But Venus can also be very flirty, right? Venus is receptive and is being able to attract. Juno really represents that person, you go to the wall for. All right, that it's really it's very specific just to marriage. So you would look at Juno, and is Juno retrograde? Because if Juno is retrograde, that's, I don't say it's the same as Venus retrograde, but it tells you right there. If at the very least you're here to learn a lesson here about marriage, about partnership, about unions. And so you'll look at Juno, you'll look at the house it's in, you'll look at the aspects it makes. Is it the most important in the chart? Different astrologers, work, we're all drawn to different things. So to me, Juno is not the number one thing that I mentioned. As you can see, I mentioned it last. But you can consider Juno as well to give you some more information. Because it will tell you, especially the Juno sign, the type of, I'm just going to say the type of partner in terms of some of the qualities. And again, is an example. If Juno is in Taurus, you need somebody who is loyal, a solid person, someone who is really, I'm going to say, committed to the union, and probably somebody who has some good financial sense. I don't want to say that they have to have money. I don't want to make anyone sound like a gold digger, but these are things that are more important. It's also someone, again, values, somebody who stands by their values. They don't just, talk the talk. They walk the walk. If you've got Juno in Aries, you want somebody who's more or Sagittarius, an adventurous spirit. All right. Juno in Aries, someone maybe who's a little bit more passionate. So you can look at that as well. So beyond the houses, as I say, and of course in all the planets, and Venus, as it turns out, Venus may be in one of your relationship houses, 5, 7, or 8, or it may rule one of them. So, and if it does, well, it sort of takes on a double influence or a stronger influence. So you'll pay more attention to it. And as far as, I just want to mention Mars and Venus, might as well mention Mars here for a moment. The whole Mars, I hate to say Mars, Venus, when you're talking about cross aspects or even within the chart, I'm not saying it's not important at all, but if I'm looking for the promise and the potential of love in terms of, a lasting union, a meaningful union, if Mars is certainly ruling one of those houses or in one of those houses, I'm definitely going to pay attention to it. But the Venus-Mars within it, not my, it's not something I'd really look for. I will look at all the aspects to Venus, and certainly there's a Venus-Mars aspect. I'm going to take it, into consideration, but not something that I'm just going to go in there and dive deep and say, oh, is there a Venus-Mars connection? And if there isn't, is that an issue? No, it's not. Okay, it's not. And also, the last thing I am just going to say about the relationships, because when it comes to, and I said to you, lessons, if you are looking for the promise of love and the North and South nodes are in Aries and Libra, okay, or there's an interception in the chart across houses 1 and 7, or no matter what houses are intercepted, okay, the signs that are intercepted are Aries and Libra. Well, you are talking about the axis of relationships there. So pay attention to that. because it doesn't mean, it's not a foregone conclusion of, oh my goodness, relationship, lesson or issue. But I will say to you, there is a relationship issue or relationship lesson in the chart. To what degree, whether it's going to be troublesome is another story, and it may not be. When it comes to the Aries Libra and we talk about the relationships, very often it is more along the line of marriage and partnership. But I'm going to say to you, not always. It depends on the rest of the chart. If it is a romantic issue and there's really heavy romantic lessons to learn, let's say connected to marriage, you're going to see other things in the chart. Venus will be in the 12th house. Venus will be retrograde. Venus will be, in some type of a hard aspect to Neptune, to Uranus, to Pluto, to Saturn, right? That's a whole, right? Other, could be a lesson on itself. But it can be relationships, lessons with authority figures, which can certainly include parents and bosses, or it could just be lessons connected to family. And I always say this, our family members, yes, we find them in the 4th house, the 10th house, the 3rd house, our siblings, we can find our aunts and uncles and our in-laws, but many of our family relationships are also one-to-one relationships, and they belong in that 7th house. They're lifelong relationships in many cases, and sometimes they're adversarial relationships. So I will say for the most part, it will be more connected to romance. And on another note, if you are looking strictly at love and romance, you want to look for the same thing, okay, in terms of the nodes, interceptions, all right, in Leo and Aquarius, all right, North and South node, Leo and Aquarius, an interception between houses 5 and 11, and also any interception where the signs intercepted are Leo and Aquarius. Because why? Well, those are the 5th and the 11th house. And the 5th house is love given, the 11th house is love received, but they are very much connected to romance. Don't see that as often, I'll be frank with you, but I will tell you, you can, if you notice it, consider it in the entire equation. So that wraps that up for today. All right. So, let's see. This, as I said, the lessons will be out on Saturday. Saturdays from now on, the lessons. Yeah, well, they're mostly lessons, right? Let's be honest, these podcasts. And so my website, www.debraclementastrologer.com. If you're interested in the mediumship or the psychic mediumship, you can, actually there's a link from DebraClementAstrologer.com, but you can also go to dacmedium.com. My astrology website is in the process behind the scenes of getting a makeover, but not sure when that'll really happen because, and this is why I say about the priorities, really, it's sort of the courses that are coming first in the event. So, once again, I want to thank you for joining me this week. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends, promote it on social media. I really appreciate it. Good reviews, 5-star reviews, to be frank, 5-star reviews. It's great because it helps the show to get discovered. So thank you so much. And until next time, may Jupiter's blessings be your constant companion.